Imagine being the soldier who not only witnessed the crucifixion of Jesus, but was the very one to pierce his side. Thinking he was simply fulfilling a duty, this soldier, hardened by war and conditioned to obey without question, expected nothing more than another routine execution. But what he witnessed would alter the course of his life forever. A man who, even in agony, radiated an unbreakable strength, offering forgiveness instead of condemnation. As the sky darkened at noon and the ground trembled beneath his feet, the soldier felt a force he couldn't comprehend. Instead of a sense of victory, he was overwhelmed by a weight he couldn't explain. A simple act, one thrust of the spear, yet the consequences would be profound. Amid the chaos of that moment, one question loomed. What becomes of a man after an encounter so powerful? You're about to uncover the fate of this soldier. How what seemed like an ordinary day turned into the beginning of an unexpected, life-altering journey. Are you ready to unveil the hidden impact of the crucifixion? His story may just be the awakening you need. It was an ordinary day for a Roman soldier, hardened by years of battle, witnessing countless executions. Yet, on that fateful day standing by the cross of Jesus, something shifted within him. Watching the serene yet tormented figure, the soldier felt an unfamiliar sensation, a whisper of doubt in his heart. How could someone endure such pain with such peace? For a moment, he questioned what true strength really meant. The Roman centurion had always believed that power lay in brute force. But as he watched Jesus, beaten, bruised, yet unwavering, a glimmer of understanding surfaced. This wasn't weakness. It was strength in its purest form. It was as if Jesus held a power not in his muscles but in his spirit, and that shook the soldier to his core, challenging everything he'd known. While every crucifixion was routine, this one felt different. The way Jesus bore his suffering, silent yet resilient, seemed almost supernatural to the centurion. In his world, men begged, cursed, spat in desperation. But Jesus, this man who claimed to be the king of the Jews, stood quietly, almost as if he knew something they all didn't. That calm gaze seemed to cut deeper than any weapon ever could. For a Roman soldier who prided himself on strength, witnessing Jesus's demeanor was a moment of profound reflection. Could it be that true strength wasn't about control over others, but control over oneself? The thought was so foreign it felt wrong, even dangerous. Yet, as he glanced around, he saw he wasn't alone in his awe. Other soldiers, even the hardened ones, seemed just as moved. The centurion, who had likely stood over countless condemned men, was unprepared for the impact Jesus would have on him. Each time he looked at Jesus, he felt a strange pull at his heart. He wondered if, perhaps, true strength wasn't about standing tall but about enduring without retaliation. This was new ground for him, and he wasn't sure if he liked it, but he couldn't look away. Reflecting on Jesus, the centurion couldn't shake off an unsettling thought. What if strength and compassion could coexist? This idea, so counter to his Roman upbringing, filled him with unease. Yet here was Jesus, embodying both with a quiet authority that spoke louder than any commander's shout. It wasn't what he expected from a king, but it felt, strangely, like a truth he'd always missed. The more the centurion observed, the clearer it became. Jesus wasn't just any man. Despite the torture, he seemed almost serene, as if his suffering served a greater purpose. For a man like the centurion, who found purpose only in orders, this shook him deeply. He started to wonder if strength could be about standing for something beyond oneself, even in the face of certain death. In the moments that followed, the centurion found himself grappling with an unfamiliar feeling: respect, even admiration. He'd been taught to despise weakness, yet here he was, feeling drawn to Jesus. How could someone with no weapons, no defense, wield such power over those around him? It was a question he couldn't shake, no matter how hard he tried. As the hours passed, the centurion's view of strength began to change. He found himself almost hoping he could show the same resilience if ever put to the test. The way Jesus embraced his fate, unwavering, made the centurion question his own courage. Was he as brave as he believed? Would he hold his ground if he faced a similar trial? The thought humbled him. He noticed other soldiers whispering, exchanging glances, clearly unsettled by Jesus' composure. It was as though Jesus' calmness was a silent rebuke to all their training. For the first time, the centurion felt that maybe brute force wasn't the highest form of power. Maybe, just maybe, real power lay in control over one's spirit, and that control seemed to radiate from Jesus in waves. With each passing minute, the centurion became more introspective, asking questions he'd never dared before. What if there was a strength beyond the physical? What if it was about character, resilience, and an unbreakable spirit? Jesus seemed to possess something that transcended his physical ordeal, a peace that left the centurion both mystified and drawn. As the crucifixion wore on, the centurion found himself deeply moved, almost vulnerable. He hadn't expected this assignment to shake him to his core. Every glance at Jesus was a reminder that perhaps he'd misunderstood power all his life. What if real strength wasn't about conquering others but about conquering oneself? It was a question that would haunt him long after this day. Standing by the cross, the centurion realized he would never be the same. The image of Jesus, pierced, humiliated, yet dignified, left an indelible mark on him. He couldn't explain it, but in that moment, he felt a bond, a connection beyond words. This was no ordinary man, and somehow he knew this was only the beginning of his reflection. As the day wore on, something strange began to happen. A darkness settled over the land, though it was midday. The centurion and those around him couldn't make sense of it. It was as if the heavens themselves were mourning. For a soldier used to predictable battles and strategies, the unpredictability of nature itself was unsettling. This darkness seemed like a message, a sign beyond human control. The soldiers glanced at each other, a mixture of confusion and fear in their eyes. How could the sun simply disappear like this? The centurion felt an eerie sensation, a chill that crept up his spine. This wasn't the typical Roman spectacle. This was something far beyond their understanding. The air itself seemed thick, charged with an energy they couldn't see but could certainly feel. Then came the tremor. The ground shook beneath them, rattling armor and shifting stones. The centurion had faced many threats, but none quite like this, a force he couldn't fight, couldn't anticipate. It was as if the earth was reacting to the events unfolding at the cross. He found himself steadying his stance, not just against the quake, but against the rising unease in his heart. This combination of darkness and tremors unsettled even the most hardened soldiers. Nature itself seemed to revolt against what was happening to Jesus. The centurion couldn't explain it, but he knew that this was no coincidence. The world was responding, almost rebelling against the suffering of the man before them. For the first time, he wondered if they were all part of something much greater. Among the crowd, whispers grew louder as people pointed at the sky, at the trembling earth. Some clutched their chests, murmuring about divine wrath. The centurion, who had dismissed such ideas as superstition, found himself wondering, what if this wasn't just another crucifixion? What if there was something more here, a power that went beyond their swords and shields? As the darkness lingered, an odd calm settled over the scene, amplifying every sound, every movement. The centurion could hear the soft sobs of onlookers, the faint murmurs of prayers. Normally, the end of a life was a loud, chaotic affair. Yet here, with this darkness pressing down, it felt like even the world was holding its breath. He wondered if he, too, was beginning to feel this power. For the centurion, this moment was surreal. A day when everything familiar seemed to turn on its head. The darkness, the quake, the whispers of the crowd, all these signs forced him to question the very nature of his duty. It was one thing to be a soldier, an enforcer of Roman law, but here, he felt like a mere man, small and vulnerable before a force he couldn't name. At one point, he closed his eyes, trying to shut out the strangeness, to convince himself it was all coincidence. But the darkness wouldn't lift, and the tremors seemed to resonate deep within him. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was witnessing something profound, something meant to be remembered. For a soldier who lived for orders, this was a rare, humbling experience. The centurion found himself staring up at the sky, searching for answers that wouldn't come. This darkness felt different, almost alive, as though it had purpose. The soldier's logic, built on discipline and hierarchy, was useless here. How could he fight or resist something he couldn't see? And more hauntingly, why did he feel like this darkness understood the pain unfolding below? Other soldiers muttered about omens, about gods being displeased. The centurion, who'd never paid heed to myths, now felt their weight. Maybe the divine was real. More real than he'd ever cared to consider. And if so, what did it mean that nature itself responded to this man's suffering? It was a question he knew he would carry for a long time. A question without any easy answers. Amid the darkness, the cries of the crowd softened, as if even they sensed the magnitude of this event. Some knelt, while others looked skyward with wide, frightened eyes. The centurion noticed his own hands trembling. A reaction he couldn't control. He'd fought wars and quelled rebellions, but nothing had ever touched him like this. An invisible force he couldn't conquer. As the ground steadied and the darkness began to dissipate, the centurion felt both relief and loss. He realized he'd come to rely on that darkness, and as if it shielded him from a truth he wasn't ready to face. But now, with the light returning, the reality of what he'd witnessed remained. It was a weight he couldn't shake, a memory he knew would haunt him. Looking around, the centurion saw fear and awe reflected in the eyes of those nearby. Everyone seemed changed, altered by these unexplainable signs. He knew that the darkness and the earthquake would become stories passed down, retold by those who'd stood there, and in the quiet of his own heart, he wondered if he, too, would tell this story one day, sharing a truth he didn't fully understand. Now, share your thoughts in the comments. What do you think was going through that soldier's mind at that moment? Do you believe that someone who lived such a hardened life could truly be transformed by an experience like this? I'd love to hear what you think. Let's talk in the comments. As the crucifixion continued, an unexpected sound broke through the pain. A prayer. Jesus, amidst his agony, called out to God, not for revenge, but for forgiveness for those who had condemned him. The centurion, used to hearing curses and pleas from the dying, was struck by this compassionate plea. It was as if Jesus held no hatred in his heart, only mercy. This baffled him. He had never seen anything like it. The centurion glanced at his fellow soldiers, wondering if they, too, felt the weight of those words. Normally, a condemned man would curse his executors. But Jesus was different. This man wasn't asking for escape or vengeance. He was asking for grace, for those who had inflicted his suffering. For a soldier raised on justice by the sword, this act of forgiveness felt almost surreal. In that moment, the centurion felt something within him shift. How could a man forgive so easily, especially in such pain? He couldn't understand it, yet he felt its power, its inexplicable strength. It was as though Jesus was showing him another kind of courage, one that didn't require a sword or armor, a courage that went beyond pride, beyond the need to win. This prayer left him unsettled. If Jesus could forgive such an injustice, what did that mean for him? A soldier who had brought suffering to others. The centurion found himself reflecting on his own actions, wondering if he'd ever be capable of such compassion. The thought was foreign, almost uncomfortable, yet he couldn't help but admire it, to feel drawn to it, even if he didn't fully understand. He wondered if forgiveness could truly change a man's heart. If so, was it possible for a hardened soldier like himself to experience it? He'd been taught that mercy was a weakness, that forgiveness made one vulnerable. But Jesus didn't look weak. He looked powerful in a way that defied explanation. This display of mercy challenged everything the centurion had ever believed. The centurion watched as others in the crowd reacted to Jesus' words. Some sneered, mocking his prayer, while others fell silent as if sensing something sacred in the air. He realized that forgiveness was more than just a word. It was an act of strength, perhaps even defiance. It was a way to reclaim one's spirit from hatred, a choice that few would dare to make. He couldn't shake the impact of Jesus' prayer. It echoed in his mind, unsettling him in a way no battle ever had. This wasn't just a dying man's last words. It was a lesson, a call to live differently. The centurion began to see that perhaps forgiveness was a kind of victory, one that went beyond conquering enemies. It was a victory over oneself, a freedom that no one could steal. Reflecting on his own life, the centurion felt a pang of regret. How many had he hurt, thinking it was just part of the job, just another duty? Watching Jesus, he wondered if he had misunderstood strength all along. What if true power lay in letting go of the need for vengeance? It was a radical thought, one he wasn't ready to accept fully, yet he knew he couldn't ignore. As the minutes passed, the centurion began to feel a strange respect for Jesus, not just as a man, but as a force of nature. This was someone who defied every rule, every expectation, forgiving those who wronged him. This was something no Roman soldier would do, something he himself could never imagine doing. And yet, he found himself yearning for that kind of strength. Others in the crowd were moved, too, whispering among themselves, uncertain but clearly affected. Jesus' prayer seemed to reach even the hardest hearts, resonating like a silent song. The centurion watched as people's expressions softened, as if forgiveness was something they, too, could taste. It was a powerful, invisible force, one that left him feeling small, yet somehow hopeful. In his mind, the centurion replayed Jesus' words, each one a challenge to the life he knew. He'd been trained to be hard, unyielding, yet here was a man who showed that the hardest hearts could be touched. Maybe forgiveness wasn't a sign of weakness but of wisdom. A wisdom that could free a man from hatred, that could bring peace where there was only conflict. He wondered if he would ever have the courage to follow such a path. Would he ever be able to forgive those who wronged him? Could he find the strength to offer mercy instead of punishment? Jesus' prayer for forgiveness opened questions he'd never considered, questions that left him more vulnerable than any wound. It was as if a door had opened within him, revealing possibilities he'd never seen. As he stood there, he felt the weight of his armor, the heaviness of his own grudges and battles. Jesus, bare and suffering, seemed lighter somehow, unburdened by hatred. This, the centurion realized, was a different kind of armor, one that no weapon could penetrate, and he wondered if perhaps, one day, he could wear such an armor himself. In that quiet moment, with Jesus' words still hanging in the air, the centurion understood that forgiveness wasn't about erasing the past. It was about freeing the heart to embrace something greater. He felt a strange hope rising, a seed planted in his soul. And as he looked at Jesus, he sensed that this was only the beginning of a journey he hadn't known he was seeking. As the final hours of the crucifixion approached, an unusual stillness settled over the crowd. Many had come with hardened hearts, ready to mock and jeer, but something in the air seemed to change them. The centurion noticed it first in the faces of his fellow soldiers, their eyes less fierce, their postures less rigid. For a brief moment, they were no longer soldiers but witnesses to something beyond their understanding. Among the bystanders, expressions softened. Some gazed upward, their faces reflecting awe and confusion. The centurion himself felt a change he couldn't quite explain. He'd come as a guard, a man of duty, yet now he found himself questioning the very nature of justice and punishment. It was as though Jesus' presence had cast a spell, opening hearts that had long been closed. He noticed a woman in the crowd, eyes red from tears, clutching her hands in silent prayer. Another man, who had been shouting moments before, now stood silent, staring at the cross with an intensity that suggested both fear and reverence. It was like watching a transformation, not just in individuals, but in the collective spirit of everyone present. They were no longer strangers, but seekers, drawn by a mystery they couldn't name. The centurion felt this shift most deeply among his fellow soldiers. Men who had once spoken only of battle now murmured quietly, glancing toward the cross with uncertainty. They had come to enforce order, yet found themselves moved by something they couldn't control. The centurion wondered if, like him, they too felt a pull toward this man, a desire to understand the strength that radiated from him even in his final moments. He thought back to the many executions he'd witnessed, each one brutal and chaotic, but this was different. This felt almost sacred. The centurion couldn't deny the weight of what was happening. He saw others lowering their heads, some even whispering prayers. It was as though the crucifixion had unlocked a door within each heart, revealing a shared vulnerability, a collective yearning for something beyond the everyday. Glancing around, the centurion noticed young and old, rich and poor, all gathered together in this strange communion. People who might never speak to one another under normal circumstances now shared a silent understanding. They weren't here for a spectacle. They were witnessing something that resonated with the deepest parts of their souls. It was a unity he'd never seen, a bond that defied rank and status. Even the other soldiers seemed to feel it. Their expressions, once indifferent, now held a trace of respect, perhaps even reverence. The centurion wondered if they, too, were experiencing the same inner turmoil, the same confusion between duty and conscience. He sensed that many of them would remember this day, not as another assignment, but as a turning point in their lives. The centurion himself felt drawn into this transformation. He'd always believed that people couldn't change, that once hardened, a man stayed that way. Yet here he was, witnessing change on a grand scale, an awakening in the hearts of those who had come only to judge and condemn. He wondered if, perhaps, he could be changed too. Amid this shared silence, there was a feeling of expectation, as if something monumental was unfolding before them. Even those who didn't understand or believe seemed captivated, bound to this moment by an invisible thread. The centurion knew he'd never look at a crowd the same way again. These people, these faces, were no longer mere onlookers but participants in a story that would be told for generations. The centurion saw it as a quiet miracle, a shift that didn't require grand gestures but spread through a look, a tear, a whispered prayer. This was transformation, not forced but gently awakened. He felt a surge of hope, a feeling he rarely entertained. If Jesus could inspire change here, at the very point of death, what did that mean for the living? What power could this kind of transformation hold in the world? Watching the crowd, he noticed that even the most skeptical onlookers seemed affected. A man who had come with his family sneered at first, but by the end, his eyes had softened. The centurion realized that people didn't have to understand everything to feel it. Sometimes, all it took was presence, the undeniable sense that something profound was happening, something that spoke directly to the heart. For the centurion, this wasn't just about a single day. He knew that what he was witnessing would ripple outward, affecting those who'd seen it and those who would hear of it. He understood that transformation wasn't always loud. Sometimes, it was the quiet stirring within that had the most lasting impact, and he felt honored, humbled to be part of it, even if he didn't fully grasp its meaning. This silent shift, this unspoken unity, was the truest power he had ever felt. As he looked at Jesus, he knew that this man, even in his suffering, was sowing seeds that would grow for generations. The centurion sensed that his own life would change too, and though he didn't yet know how, he felt a deep, unshakable conviction that he was no longer the same man who had come to Golgotha that morning. The centurion wondered if he would ever have the courage to embrace the transformation he saw unfolding. This wasn't just a story he'd tell, but an experience that had reshaped him. Deep down, looking at the cross, he sensed that his journey was only beginning, one that would continue long after he left this place. And in that realization, he felt a strange peace, as though he'd been given a glimpse of something eternal. As the crucifixion neared its end, the centurion felt an awareness dawning on him. This was more than just an execution, it was a pivotal moment for humanity. He realized that Jesus' suffering went beyond physical pain. It held a purpose that resonated in the depths of his own soul. Here, on this hill, something ancient and profound was being fulfilled, a promise made in ages past. It was as if every life, every story, was converging at this single point. The centurion, who had always valued action and power, began to see that Jesus' sacrifice was about something entirely different. It wasn't about victory in the traditional sense, but about redemption, about offering a way back to something pure and unbroken. The crucifixion was a bridge, a path opened between humanity and the divine. He sensed that this act of surrender held a power stronger than any weapon. He remembered the scriptures he'd heard fragments of, tales of prophets who spoke of a coming Messiah. Standing there, he wondered if Jesus was the one those ancient voices had foretold. It was a startling thought, that this man, crucified like a common criminal, was fulfilling a divine promise. He saw now that the crucifixion wasn't a defeat. It was a triumph in disguise, one that would echo for centuries. The centurion's mind raced, connecting pieces he'd never considered before. He realized that Jesus' death was not just for his own time but for generations yet unborn. This was a moment that would ripple through history, a new covenant that offered hope where there had been none. He felt as though he was witnessing the foundation of something unbreakable, a gift offered freely to all. For a man who had known only the law of Rome, this idea of a divine covenant was almost inconceivable. Yet watching Jesus, he felt that this was a promise meant for every heart, Roman or Jew, soldier or slave. It was a truth that transcended boundaries, calling each person to a new way of life. The centurion began to understand that this was a call, a beckoning to every soul, offering reconciliation with the divine. As Jesus breathed his last, the centurion felt a weight lift, as if the very earth recognized the end of a long, sacred journey. He realized that the crucifixion had accomplished something beyond human comprehension, a restoration, a way for people to find peace with their Creator. It was a mystery, but one that filled him with an inexplicable hope, a feeling he'd rarely allowed himself to embrace. Looking at the cross, he understood that Jesus had become a bridge, a way for humanity to reach something higher, something holy. This wasn't just about one man's suffering. It was about opening a path to salvation, an invitation to all who would follow. The centurion felt the pull of that invitation. Even if he didn't yet fully grasp its depth, it was a calling that resonated deeply, like an ancient melody in his heart. The centurion knew that for many, this day would be forgotten, lost in the march of history. But for others, it would be remembered as a day of change, a turning point for humanity. He felt honored to be among those who understood its significance, even if only partially. This crucifixion would become a story, a legend, a truth that would shape lives and nations. It was more than he'd ever hoped to witness. He realized that Jesus' sacrifice was a challenge to the world, a call to love, to forgive, to rise above hatred and judgment. For a man of war, this was a radical idea, but he felt its truth like a fire within him. This crucifixion was more than a death. It was a declaration of life, of grace, of boundless mercy. The centurion sensed that this was the heart of the message, a love that could conquer even death. The cross now felt like a symbol, not of defeat, but of ultimate victory, a victory that redefined power itself. It was no longer about might or conquest, but about surrender, humility, and grace. The centurion found himself drawn to this idea, this new definition of strength. It was a strength that didn't seek to control but to free, a strength that offered peace instead of fear. As he looked around, he saw others feeling the same transformation. Faces once filled with anger now held tears, silent testimonies to the power of what they'd witnessed. The centurion knew that this day would mark the beginning of a new era, one that would be spoken of long after he was gone. It was a legacy not built on the sword, but on love, on a sacrifice that demanded nothing in return. The centurion wondered if he could ever live by this new kind of power, one that sought to lift others instead of dominating them. He knew it would be a journey, a path of struggle and doubt. Yet, as he stood before the cross, he felt that he had been given a gift, a glimpse of a truth that could transform his life, if only he had the courage to follow it. In the quiet that followed, he felt a sense of completeness, as though every question, every search for meaning had led to this moment. This crucifixion, this act of love, was the answer he'd been seeking without even knowing it. It was an invitation, a call to join in the promise that had been made to all humanity. And as he looked up at the cross one last time, he felt an unshakable resolve to carry this truth forward. The centurion walked away from that hill a changed man, bearing a responsibility that was both heavy and liberating. He knew he would face challenges, doubts, but he was willing to carry this message, to share the light he had found. This was not the end. It was the beginning of a journey that would echo through time, and in that knowledge, he felt a peace that words could never capture. So, after all of this, one question remains. What would you do if faced with the kind of truth that could change your life? The journey of the soldier who pierced Jesus' side is more than a story of transformation. It's a call to each of us. His encounter with forgiveness, strength, and compassion set him on a path that wasn't easy, yet it offered him a peace he'd never known. And perhaps, just like him, we're being invited to consider what true power and redemption really mean. Ask yourself, could you embrace forgiveness when it feels impossible? Could you pursue a strength that comes not from force, but from humility? This story shows us that even the hardest of hearts can be softened, that the greatest transformations often come from the most unexpected places. Are you ready to step into a life shaped by compassion, truth, and the kind of peace that the world can't offer? If you've felt inspired or challenged by this journey, don't miss out on more stories that dig deep into the lives of those who encountered Jesus in life-changing ways. Make sure to subscribe to our channel and activate notifications so you can continue exploring these profound truths. Let's walk this path together, seeking answers that don't just inform us but truly transform us.